Our study tonight begins in verse 32, at least halfway through verse 32. And we're going to go to chapter 12, verse 1. Would you read along with me, please? I'll read the whole verse 32, and then I'll tell you where we're going to start. And what more shall I say? Do not have time to tell about Gideon or Barak. Now, we studied those last time. Here's where our study tonight starts. Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions. Now remember, all of this is by faith. Who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, and in caves, and in holes in the ground. These were all committed for their faith. Highlight this, please. Yet none of them received what had been promised. As harsh as that sounds, here's why. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Now, if you heard that carefully, every one of these Hall of Faith heroes would exchange places with you and me in a minute. God had better planned for us. Our walk by faith is better, because together with us, these Old Testament saints will be made perfect. Chapter 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Father, as we begin tonight, Lord, I really hope and pray that our faith has grown. I pray, Lord, that we have learned that you are trustworthy. I pray that in those times when we have been fearful and other times when we simply can't seem to find our way out of whatever problem we're in, I pray that you've spoken to us from the lives of these men and women. And now, Lord, as we finish this chapter, we ask you to increase our faith. Help us to trust you a little more, a little longer than all of the other times before. And for everyone who's here tonight, I pray that as our faith grows, so too will our hearts to ask you to do even more for us and through us. Additionally, I pray, Lord, that if there's anybody here tonight who isn't yet yours, if they're not born again, that tonight they would give their hearts to you. Lastly, Lord, if there are those among us who are yours, but we feel like our lives are spent in caves or in holes, or we feel like we're the ones who are destitute, whether it's physically or materially or spiritually, let us believe tonight by faith, remembering always that without faith it's impossible to please you. May we please you tonight by saying, Jesus, tonight and from now on, I trust in you. Bless this time, we ask that you would be glorified. Amen. My favorite superhero. Now, I'm not a Marvel superhero kind of guy. My favorite superhero is much simpler. Here I come to save the day. It's Mighty Mouse. Now, if you're old as I am, you remember two Mighty Mouses. One of them was a little skinny Mighty Mouse. I didn't like him. My Mighty Mouse was buff, and he rode in on a rocket. And no matter what he was facing, he always emerged victorious. And I grew up, I wanted Mighty Mouse everything. We had Mighty Mouse lunch boxes. We had Mighty Mouse pillowcases. Mighty Mouse everything, because he was my hero. Now, as we've been going through Hebrews chapter 11, I think part of our problem when we look at a chapter like this is we make the characters our heroes. I didn't put it together that Mighty Mouse was a cartoon, that he couldn't really do anything for me. I just knew that he always won. Well, we look at lives like the ones that we've been studying these last 13 weeks, and what we think about is, well, I want to be like them. I want my faith to be strong like theirs. But one of the reasons I've taken so long through this chapter is that I want you to realize that these are not strong people. They're people who believe in and ultimately trusted in a really strong God. You see, Hebrews chapter 11, make no mistake, the hero is God. He's the one who's faithful when these people were not. He's the one who strengthened us, who strengthened all of the characters here that they could finish the course and finish well. And in some cases, as we'll see tonight, some of them didn't really do anything exemplary until it was time to die. And then with one last gasp, they were saved because they believed in God. Samson is the one that I was just speaking of. He is our first character tonight. And he is a story of wasted potential. One of the most outstanding and yet tragic figures in the Bible. And yet we find him here in Hebrews chapter 11. I had a call on the radio show a couple of weeks ago. Pastor Ron, why is Samson in the Hall of Fame of Faith? And the answer is because he died really, really well. Now, obviously, we don't want to have to die well to please God with our faith. But Samson was one of those men who gave in to his flesh and sacrificed nearly everything that he had. He's one of the most tragic figures because of Samson. It said that the spirit departed from him and he knew it not. Of Samson at the end of his life, it turns out as he was grinding the grain, the Philistines were making sport of him after having put out his eyes. All that was left of his witness was to be mocked by the very Philistines that he would kill. Samson was a man whose troubles were caused by his own lust. He was dominated by lust. And yet still, knowing everything about him, God chose Samson to be one of Israel's deliverers, one of Israel's superheroes. He had a great beginning. I mean, his birth was announced by Jesus himself. In Judges chapter 13, the angel of the Lord, that's always Jesus in a pre-incarnate appearance in the Old Testament, appeared to Samson's parents and said, of this man that you are to serve, of his mother, you are sterile and childless, but you are going to conceive and have a son. Now, he might as well have said, I've chosen him because I have work to do. And so he tells Samson's mom, now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean, because you will conceive and give birth to a son. No razor may be used on his head, because the boy is to be a Nazarite, that's to be separated to God for life. And he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Now, your life doesn't begin any better than that. It's quite a commendation. I've chosen this boy that I'm going to give to you. And he is going to begin the deliverance of his people, my people, from the Philistines. Now, here's the real tragedy with Samson is that during the time that he lived, his witness was so compromised by his own bondage to lust that nobody really thought highly of him. Now, they liked him when he was killing Philistines, but Samson made enemies even of his own people. Samson's eye was always wandering toward women that he couldn't have, women that he knew weren't good for him. It's easy to say, grow your hair and look like a believer. But Samson wouldn't stay away from that, which would cause him harm. Samson's wounds, all of them were self-inflicted. And he squandered his life. He squandered his strength, the strength God gave him. And finally, the Spirit departed from him. Samson's life is an example of what I call consecration, set apart, separation for God, but without communion. Samson was more interested in fellowship with the world, fellowship with the girls that were attractive to him, than he was with fellowship with God. Some of us, we struggle with the same things. We want fellowship with people. We cherish that more than our time with God. We end up with divided hearts, double-minded men, James calls us. And our witnesses are horribly compromised. When we find ourselves in that place, life gets really painful. Life gets really empty. It gets really frustrating. And we have studied through the book of Judges several times here at Calvary Chapel, and we know that Samson's life was unfulfilling. We wonder, well, what did he do? He died well with his last breath. As faith is sort of born again inside, he asked God to give him the strength one last time. There's a line at the end of Samson's life. It says, and his hair began to grow. Now, we know his strength wasn't in his hair. His strength was in his connection to God. And it took dying to reconnect. Obviously, we don't want to wait that long. If your heart is divided, if your mind is double-minded, then please let Samson's story prove to you that God can take you from where you are and still use you to do wonderful things. Remember, our promises are better. The next one is Jephthah. Jephthah was a mighty warrior, again from the book of Judges. Jephthah made a fleshy mistake. Ladies, Linda McMillan taught on Jephthah just this past Monday night. I listened to it today. She did a great job with it. Jephthah is one of those figures that sort of bothers all of us because we have no idea why he would be in there. He made the most foolish vow to God in all of our scriptures. Now, we've all had those moments where things weren't going well. God, if you get me out of this, I'll never miss church again. Or I'll serve you all the days. I'll give you my children. They'll be pastors. Well, Jephthah did that. Whatever comes out my door, Lord, if you give me victory, I'll sacrifice to you. And Jephthah, when he returned from victory, after having been sort of the undesirable kin, Jephthah, when he was victorious, came home and the first thing out of his door was his daughter. Now, we know he didn't sacrifice her. He didn't kill her. God wouldn't have permitted that. But he did sacrifice her life in the service of the Lord. She would never marry. She would never have children. Things that every Jewish woman wanted. And her life was to be set apart for the rest of it, from the world to God. The problem, it wasn't her choice. It was her father's choice. A horrible, horrible example. He's a reminder to all of us, don't make empty promises. Jesus said, don't make any vows at all. Don't make any promises. Just do the best you can. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And Jephthah certainly is confusing by his appearance here in Hebrews chapter 11. The next character is David. Now, I've actually spent a year teaching David, so I'm not going to do that tonight. I want to look at one particular incident in his life that to me is his finest moment. But David, as we know, was the mighty warrior king who was also the sweet psalmist of Israel. He was that man who had that rare combination of sensitivity and fierce strength and courage. To be a warrior without parallel, and yet to be the man with the heart for God, the heart of God. To be a man who could put his songs to paper and sing them demonstrates the tenderness of his heart. And I'm convinced, if you've heard my teachings on David before, that tender heart was really the source of David's strength. And we, especially we men, we need to learn from David. We need to be men who will fight our enemies fiercely and yet have tender hearts towards the people for whom God died, especially tender hearts for those people that he's brought into our lives. We need always to remember that our hearts need to be hearts after God's heart. It ought to be easier for us than it was for David. Jesus lives in us. Jesus did not live in David. He was a man after God's heart. We're a man who has God in our hearts. And we need to be men and women who are tender-hearted, tender and vulnerable, and as honest as David was with God when he was guilty of sin. I'm convinced that David was the best repenter in the history of the world. David was fleshy. David was carnal. David made lots and lots of horrible mistakes. But he owned them. He owned them and he got right with God. And in the process of getting right with God, God's power never was removed from him as it was from Samson. The one incident that I think personally is David's finest hour comes from 1 Samuel chapter 23. You don't have to turn there. I'm just going to tell the story. But this is really great area of study, especially for those of you who think sometimes God asks you to do some things that are unfair. This is the story of when David was told that the citizens of Keilah were being attacked by the Philistines. Keilah was in Judah. That means they were kinsmen of David. And David, against the advice of his own people, David said, I have to go rescue them. They're family. And he was warned, don't go. Saul is going to find out. This is when David was hiding in the caves. And Saul will find out and he will send his army and he will kill us. We can't go to Keilah. And David thought, no, I'm a man of God. I have to go. And his men finally convinced him to ask God. And God said, yes, go. And the men, when they got the report, they said, well, if Saul goes, and surely he will, when he comes, they're going to turn you over to Saul. And David would have thought at that moment, well, no, they won't. Not if I save their lives. I'm going to be like their hero. And yet David asked the Lord, will the people of Keilah betray me? Will they turn me over to Saul? And God said, yes, they will. But he also told David, I need you to go. Now think about that for a moment. If God told you to go minister to somebody, lead them to the Lord, pray for them, do something for them, whatever it is, and you knew they were going to betray you, you knew they were going to treat you horribly, would you be excited about doing it? David said, will they really turn me in? And the answer was, yes, they will. I mean, they're going to betray me? Yes, they will betray you. If I was David, you know what I would have said? I would have said, I'm the king. I know I'm chosen to be king. But Saul is the one who's still the king. I'm sort of a king by extension, but he's the one living like a king. He's the one who's chasing me. He's the reason that I'm living in these caves, trying to hide from him. Why don't you send the real king? And here's the answer, and this is really important for those of you who understand that God is the hero of Hebrews chapter 11. God said, yeah, I could send Saul, but Saul's not my king. You're my king. I would say, you're God's man. We've got to do what God tells us to do, regardless of the outcome. And David went and he rescued them, and David was forced to run and was chased for another 6 or 7 years by Saul and his armies. And all the while, he knew he would be betrayed. That takes great, great faith. Remember, God asks his people to do things that he won't ask other people. There are other people that may be better at it. There may be other people that could accomplish it. But God asks his people to do things. Men, when God tells you to love your wife the way Christ loved the church, there's nobody else that can do that for your wife. There's nobody else. Ladies, when God asks you to submit to the leadership of your husband, there's nobody else who can do that. And isn't it true we so often will put conditions? Well, God, if I do that, well, what's going to happen if he does this or if she does that? God says that's not something we're going to talk about. I told you to do it. Do you have the faith to do it? Can you trust me to do it? David risked his life and the life of his men to go into battle. He knew he would win, but then he also knew that he would be turned over to Saul, and it would look, of course, then like he was going to die. David was God's king. You're here tonight. You want to walk by faith. You want to put a smile on God's face. It's easy. Remember that you're God's man or you're God's woman. And you have no choice. If you want to please God, to have the faith to do what he tells you to do, no matter what. It takes great faith. I would suggest to you that we have easier access to great faith than even David did. Can you act like a Christian? Can you be a servant even when no one appreciates it? Even when they treat you or mistreat you? The only way you can do it is by faith. King David, a great hero of our faith. Samuel is the next one. Samuel is the first of the prophets and the last of the judges. Samuel had a very frustrating ministry. The people continually broke his heart. The people continually disobeyed him and disappointed him. And yet he lived in a time, he was a shining light in a time when men did what seemed right to them, and they cared nothing for the things of God. And Samuel for a time was one man who stood alone. Even when people asked for a king like other nations, Samuel accepted the fact that that's his fault. Because his son, Samuel, by the way, like David, was a horrible father. He's a man of God. He was a judge. He was a prophet. But he was a terrible, terrible dad. And when the people saw the way his sons behaved, they asked for a king like the other nations have and broke Samuel's heart. But he owned that. He knew that too was his responsibility. The next group is the prophets. This includes a great list. We've got all of the prophets in our Bibles, but it includes a list of distinguished names: Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, who's going to pop up in a moment, Jeremiah, who will pop up again, Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah, Hosea, Amos, among many, many others. And we're going through the prophecies of Isaiah now in our Wednesday night studies. We're getting pretty close to the end of that. And they are acknowledged. Now, when we listen now to what happened to these prophets, I want you to consider all of the people now in New Testament times who claim that they're a prophet of God. And they'll go around saying, I'm a prophet, thus saith the Lord. They don't live anything like these people. Listen to what the prophets had to endure. Who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, Daniel chapter 6. Can you imagine what it was like to be thrown into that lion's den? Daniel, a man at that point somewhere between his 60s and 70, 75 years of age. He served an exemplary life. He was set up by those in Babylon who were jealous of him, the Babylonians, who resented his value to the king. His king was tricked. And Daniel was thrown in the lion's den. King didn't sleep all night. When he got up in the morning to go find out how Daniel was, Daniel had a whole bunch of new pets. Why? Because of faith. Can you imagine being thrown into the lion's den? Of course you can't, but I mean, they might take me, but they would be kicking and screaming. They'd probably have to kill me before I got there. Daniel walked right in, and he sat down. I'm not a cat guy, but Daniel was. He said, "Here, kitty, kitty." And he did it by faith. Like his 3 young Hebrew friends decades before. My God can deliver us through the fire, but even if he does not, we will not bow down. Daniel wasn't going to be intimidated. Daniel's faith was heroic, courageous faith. Verse 34, quenched the fury of the flames. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those 3 young Hebrews decades earlier, who refused to bow down. Nebuchadnezzar, in a temper tantrum, turned the fire up 7 times hotter in the furnace. So hot that if any of his own soldiers got near it, they perished because of the heat. I tell you all the time that sin is insane. Nebuchadnezzar proved it. And he threw him in the fire, and of course they threw 3 young men in, and Nebuchadnezzar kind of looking over the edge. How many did we throw in? 3? That's what I thought. Well, then why is it that I see 4 walking around loose in the fire, and the 4th is like the Son of God? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Examples of uncompromised lives because of their faith in God. And escaped the edge of the sword. 2 Kings chapter 6, Elijah, the king trying to destroy him, would send armies, and Elijah would send them all dead. They would come wave after wave after wave, and they would all fall dead. And finally, the king of Aram calls his people in and says, "Why is this happening? Who's the spy?" And they tell him, "The man of God can hear the secrets that you declare in your bedroom." Elisha surrounded by certain death. And he wasn't afraid at all because he knew by faith that his God was bigger. You remember the story. His attendant got up one morning and looked out and saw that they were surrounded by Arameans. When Elisha came out, he said to him, "Master, we're going to die." I'm paraphrasing. "We're going to die here. Look at all of those people. Why aren't you worried? Why aren't you concerned?" And Elisha's answer was simple: because there are more with us than are with them. And then he prayed, "Open his eyes so that he can see." And his eyes were opened spiritually. And his attendants saw the angels, the warring angels surrounding them. And he was no longer afraid. They escaped the edge of the sword. Whose weakness was turned into strength. That describes a whole bunch of our Old Testament heroes. and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. I think of Jonathan and his armor bearer in 1 Samuel chapter 14. The armor bearer, as you know, is one of my favorite characters in Scripture, simply because he's the anonymous guy, the invisible one. He doesn't get any credit if God does something. Jonathan, by faith, wakes up one morning and says, maybe God wants to do something special today. I hope and I pray that you have those days in your life. You get up and you just feel the closeness of God and you feel like God is calling you. Let's do something really special today. Okay, Lord, I'm yours. Let's see if God wants to deliver us. He can deliver by many or by few. The odds were stacked against him. But none of that moved him. Let's see what God wants to do. Now, Jonathan, if it works, is going to get all the credit. If he dies, the armor bearer is going to die. So the armor bearer is in a no-win situation, yet he tells Jonathan, do whatever is on your heart to do. I am with you, heart and soul. It takes great faith, and of course they routed the foreign armies. Not just men are noted for their faith. Look at verse 35. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. And this is mindful of the stories of the widow of Zarephath, whose son Elijah raised to life. The woman at Shunem, who called for Elisha when her son died, because she knew by faith that he was a man of God, that he would do something. I mean, what you do when your son is dead, it's pretty much over, but no, by faith she knew, I'm going to get the man of God here. And he'll do something. The readers of Hebrews, when this was written, would remember Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha. They would remember the widow of Nain from Luke chapter 7, whose son Jesus raised from the dead. These are people that are being noted for their faith, Old Testament, but extending to those in the New Testament who followed in their footsteps. He says others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Now, we don't know who that was in the Old Testament. Now, it would have happened, I'm sure, more than once. But we know that Paul and Silas, when the opportunity to leave arose, they didn't leave the jail at Philippi. And the result was people got saved. They learned faith by the examples of others. They were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Now, what we know about this torture, the word for torture indicates the type of torture it was. It was a drum-sized rack. And that rack, the bodies were put on, and literally the bodies were torn apart in torture. And yet they endured by faith because they looked forward to a better life through resurrection. Now, that's a hard one. The Apostle Paul wrote earlier than this book of Hebrews. He wrote that for him to die is better by far. It's to gain. I'd rather depart and be with Christ. It's better by far. But to live means to serve him. And see, by faith we know those things are true. But in order to ignore your circumstances, you got to look up. You got to look up. You got to look beyond your circumstances and believe in the God who's demonstrated faith over and over and over. One thing to remember, the time we live in, we're always looking for solutions from other sources. We don't want to wait for God. We want to win an election and we'll fix the country that way. We want to have this thing happen and then our kids will be fixed, whatever our problems are. They didn't wait for anything. They trusted that God would do these things. If you want to have faith, you remember what Jesus has done, you take to heart his promises, and then when those times get really, really difficult, you remember who you are and who you serve. The people that Paul is singling out here looked to a better life rather than looking for comfort in this life. I think we've been spoiled. We know heaven's going to be great. We're looking forward. Come Jesus, come quickly. But the truth is, too many of us are too invested in this life being comfortable. And I don't think for Christians it was ever intended that it would be. I think we've been inundated with so much false teaching in the Western church, and now it's spreading all over the world, that we expect that God owes us a good life. And none of these Hall of Faith heroes would understand that they were looking for their best life then, not their best life now. And some of you will understand that is the title of a book by one of those pastors. Not a pastor, really, a preacher. A pastor cares about his people, cares enough to tell them the truth. How can we get through the difficult times that we face? By looking forward to being with Jesus. These bodies are temporary, thank God. But so too are the circumstances of our life. Now, I know 70 or so years seems like a very, very long time, the average life expectancy. But it is only a minute. It's only a second, really, compared to the life that we can experience in eternity. Verse 36, some faced jeers and flogging. That would be a lot of them. While still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned. Tradition says that Jeremiah was stoned to death at the hands of angry Jews. The people that he served, the people that he faithfully ministered to for more than 40 years. They were sawed in two. Isaiah is said to have been placed in a hollowed out log and very slowly, tortuously sawed in half during the reign of Manasseh, the most evil king in Israel's history. And he was the son of a good king, Hezekiah. And Isaiah, who we are studying on Wednesday nights, couldn't wait to be with Jesus. One of the things that we're noticing over and over and over in our Wednesday night studies through Isaiah is that his vision, his prophecy is a vision. He saw it all. And I have a picture in my mind of Isaiah when they're hollowing out that log and they're putting him in there and Manasseh is giving the orders to saw him. I have a picture of Isaiah saying, finally, I'm going to go be with God. They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, most notably Elijah and John the Baptist. John the Baptist, an Old Testament prophet, even though he appears in our New Testaments. They were destitute, they were persecuted and mistreated. And then I love this statement, in the world was not worthy of them. Think about the love of God for this world. For God so loved the world that he gave. And we know that he gave his son, but long before Jesus' incarnation, God kept giving these people the best he has to the world, a world that wasn't worthy of them. They were faithful. They were obedient. They believed. And they suffered. And God's conclusion is that the world was not worthy of them. I think if those who claim to be prophets today were asked, do you want to live like this? The answer would be no. Well, that's what it's like to be a true prophet of God. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. David, of course, for 10 years, as I mentioned early. God doesn't always deliver men or women who are faithful to him from their trials. He's with them through them. He delivers them through the trials, but he doesn't often deliver from the trial. It's interesting to me in the book of Acts that Peter is rescued from prison. An angel shows up. The doors swing open. Says, let's go. But James, just before him, wasn't delivered from anything. He was beheaded. Peter delivered from a trial. Paul remained in the middle of his trial in the jail in Philippi. And yet most of us, we just want to be delivered from our trials. God, I'm so tired. I don't want any more troubles. God says, how about you walk with me in them? It takes great faith. That's why it says, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what is promised. Now, the primary reference there is that they didn't receive the promised Christ. These were men and women who lived without ever seeing the fulfillment of those promises. You know, we talk about Jesus coming back soon all the time. And people say, I get tired of hearing that. When's he going to come? If he's not going to come, stop saying he's going to come. Well, for the history of Israel, the prophets, and these others who were noted for their faith, they didn't get the promise. It was like an IOU from heaven. And they didn't receive the promise, but they were commended by God because they were faithful. These men and women had no hopes for material wealth or physical comfort. There wasn't going to be a last-minute rescue. And yet they persevered by faith, because that's what real faith does. And it says in verse 40, and God planned something better for us. Isn't it interesting? Paul's encouraging this church of the Hebrews, some of them in danger of falling away. Persecution has been going on for the 20 to 30-year history of the church. And they're tired. And after going through this hall of fame of faith, Paul says, this was ready for you. As we revere them, remember that what God has done for us, what God has given to us, is better by far. I know I said it earlier. I'll say it again. I've said it over the years hundreds of times. Every Old Testament hero, you know, we like the miracles and we want to see the power of God. We want to call down lightning from heaven. Every one of these people would change places with you in an instant if they were given the opportunity to do so all over again. Why? Because the one thing they could never imagine was Christ in us, the hope of glory. You know, we have plans. I want to get to heaven. I want to talk to David, and I want to talk to Elijah, and I want to see these people, and I want to know what it was like, and I want to tell them how inspiring I was. I think when we get to heaven, they're going to be clamoring to talk to us. How'd you do it? Can you imagine? I've got lots of favorite characters in the Old Testament, but can you imagine Daniel coming to me and I'm just about to ask him, tell me about the lion's den. And before I can get out, he says, a free school, really? See, we don't think of what we're doing as miraculous. We don't think of what we're doing as great faith. Neither did they. They were just trying to live. They were just trying to survive and serve God. Funny story. I've got time, I think, a couple of minutes. Pastor Chuck was asked to speak at a place where Billy Graham was going to also speak. And Pastor Chuck, who was never moved by anybody really, He wasn't somebody who looked at me and thought, ooh, like that. But Billy Graham was sort of different for him. He said, what will I say to him? I'm going to be so nervous. And so he sort of kind of rehearsed what he was going to say. Thank you for your faithful service. Thank you for your example. Whatever it was, he sort of had it ready to go. And just before he had the opportunity, when somebody introduced him face to face for the very first time to Billy Graham said, Chuck Smith, I've always wanted to meet you. These Old Testament heroes can't wait to meet us. God had planned something better for us so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Here's the therefore, and I'm not going to teach this verse tonight. I'm just going to refer to it and set you up for next time. Therefore, there's always a therefore, and now we get into my favorite section of Hebrews, the practical section. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, and that's where we're going to cut it off tonight, we look at this and we think, wow, those people are in heaven and they're looking down and they're watching us. They're witnesses to all that God is doing to us. That isn't at all what this says. They're not witnesses of what we're doing. They're witnesses to us of the faithfulness of God. Remember, I said God is the hero of Hebrews chapter 11. They're witnesses to us of God's faithfulness. Can you imagine what Samson would say to somebody now? Maybe you've fallen away. Maybe lust is an issue that you deal with. And you're thinking, well, God can never use me. Can you imagine what Samson would say to you? I ruined it worse than you ever thought of. But look what God did. It said he killed more as he died than he did when he was alive. That's a lot of people. Samson is a witness to us of God's faithfulness. All of these people are witnesses to us of God's faithfulness. They're not watching us. They set the example that proves that we too can trust in a huge, huge God who will fulfill every promise. Whatever it is you're going through, no matter how tough it is, this God of Hebrews chapter 11 is with you. This God of Hebrews chapter 11 is for you. And he will walk with you through any trial. All you have to do is believe. 13 Bible studies in chapter 11. And I may have bored you with the tedious exposition of it. However, I wanted you to see how big God is. And if he can use these people, he's certainly going to use you, and he's certainly going to use me. God is faithful even when we're not. If you're here tonight and you need to repent, we're going to give you that opportunity in just a moment. Could we have the men and women from the pastor's class come up and be prepared to pray? If you're here tonight and you need physical or emotional healing, would you come up and ask? Don't just pretend I didn't say anything. Just wait to get out. Tonight is a night to pray. Tonight is a night with a grateful heart to let your requests be made known to God. Whatever it is that you have need of, God wants to meet you here tonight. And that's why we do this. Please don't miss out. Father, I pray that our faith has grown